So welcome everyone to this IES webinar for the report launch of Biodiversity Net Gain in Practice, 1 year on from mandatory implementation. This is the culmination of a collaborative project between the IES's Environmental Policy Implementation Community, or EPIC, the IES Environmental Impact Assessment Community, and the Association of Local Government Ecologists, or ALGE. As some of you may be aware, the IES's 2024 to 2027 strategy, enabling interdisciplinary solutions through science and connections, highlights the importance of collaboration and knowledge exchange across specialisms within environmental science, and our communities and partnerships offers a valuable tool for facilitating this. As communities and partnerships lead, I was delighted to see the brilliant work done through this collaboration, and I'm really excited to build on the success of this project to deliver more cross-community events and partnerships. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Ellie Savage, who will be presenting today. Ellie is Policy Officer with the IES. She is responsible for supporting the work of EPIC and leads the BNG and Practice Project Working Group. Before joining the IES, Ellie led on local government policy and research at a climate change and democratic engagement charity. Thanks so much for joining us, Ellie.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks for that introduction. Just to also say, I'm actually, I'm not an ecologist. I'm not even an environmental scientist. Don't tell anybody. But yeah, I'm really here today representing the brilliant working group of IES and ALGE members that are behind the BNG in Practice report. So yeah, next slide, please, Stephanie. So yeah, this is the report that we're talking about. It was published earlier this month by the IES and ALGE. But before we dive into it, next slide, please. I thought I'd start with this news story. This story actually came out the day after we published the report. Always goes like that. But yeah, I thought to place us in the political context, we'd not ignore it. So obviously the headline here, number 10, raising questions over BNG in growth push. It's not an official government line by any stretch, but this sentiment does seem to be out there. And of course, I think it ties with what we've been seeing in the last few months, if not, actually the last few weeks, which is that politically, nature is being placed in conflict with the government's growth agenda. And I think for a long time, people, including those in government, have been saying that we need to wait and see before making any changes to BNG. But we're here today, slightly over 1 year on now, and we are clear in our report that now is the time for action to be taken. And I'll take you through what actions we're recommending in a moment. But what we're saying is that it needs to be taken urgently to ensure that A, BNG does actually deliver on its promises, but B, that it also doesn't implode and it doesn't become the next culture war issue. So next slide, please. So that was a bit of scene setting, but yeah, what am I going to talk about? I'll briefly touch on the IES and ALGE, though I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar, will be members. I'll talk about what we did to actually produce the report, then our findings, and then some next steps, and there's some exciting stuff in there. So next slide, please. Yes. So as I said, I'm sure most of you are very familiar, but for the sake of the ALGE members who are here, I'll do a quick intro to the IES and vice versa for the IES members. So the IES, the Institution of Environmental Sciences, is a professional membership body, and we represent over 6,000 environmental scientists from across the full spectrum of environmental scientists. So we've got members in air quality, land condition, climatology, ecology, land management, etc. And we've partnered with the Association of Local Government Ecologists on this project because obviously the voice of local government ecologists we thought was a really critical one in the BNG story. So next slide, please. So just quickly to say as well that the IES has several special interest groups or communities of our members. And within the IES, the report was led on by 2 IES communities. So the Environmental Policy Implementation Community, whose logo you can see on the right of this diagram, and the Environmental Impact Assessment Community, whose logo you can see on the left of this diagram. So the Environmental Policy Implementation Community, or EPIC, is a community for those undertaking or interested in environmental implementation. And the EIA community is, as you might imagine, a community for EIA professionals. So Ethne's posted some links on those in the chat if you want to find out more. So yeah, next slide, please. So a group of EPIC, EIA and ALGE members have been working on this project since July last year, and we conducted 3 stages to gathering the evidence that the report is based on. So the first stage was a survey that we sent out to IES and ALGE members around 6 months after BNG became mandatory for major sites, so in August. We received 142 responses to that survey, which gave us an early indication. See, 6 months is not really long in planning, but an early indication of where the problems might be. And then building on this, secondly, we then held a workshop at the EPIC conference in October with 60 participants looking into those issues raised in the survey in a bit more detail. Before the third and final stage, during which we conducted 12 interviews from December to January with an experienced group of BNG practitioners, including ecologists, planners, developers, habitat banks and brokers. So this is our evidence gathering process. Some of you here today might have been involved in one or more of these stages, so in which case, thank you very much. But this is the practitioner evidence base that the report draws on in its findings and recommendations. And as professional bodies, we think it's really important to listen to those delivering on the ground and to amplify those voices. So that's what we tried to do in the report. So next slide, please. So our findings, what did we find? Our report has 7 sections and makes over 22 recommendations to Defra, Natural England, local planning authorities, professional bodies and other supporting organisations. And I'm going to take you through some of the key findings and recommendations in each section. But of course, I can't cover everything today. This presentation already might be quite long, so I'd recommend to look at the report to get a comprehensive understanding of all the findings. And again, I think Ephanie's popped that in the chat. So first section, so next slide. So a systems approach to BNG. I think we all know that the biodiversity crisis is deeply and inextricably linked with the crises of climate change and environmental pollution, and that nature systems are deeply linked with our food, water, climate, and health systems. So next slide. So we've got some diagrams here just to kind of really drive that home. So IPBES is the UN Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And they published a nexus assessment of the interlinkages amongst biodiversity, water, food and health in December last year. So you can see the interactions between those systems on the left. And on the right, you can also see what happens if we try and take an approach that puts one system first without considering and trying to utilise and balance the interactions between systems. And what you get is, some of those systems get a red line, which is not good, to put it simply. So next slide. So what does taking a systems approach to BNG look like? It requires BNG to be clearly and purposefully integrated with wider environmental policy. I think the quote on the right, which was from one of our interviewees, really sums that up perfectly. So looked at in isolation, BNG simply requires the achievement of a minimum 10% biodiversity gain. And instead of a holistic approach that supports habitat delivery in the right place, taking into account all of these other factors and all of these other systems, when looked at in isolation, BNG is at risk of churning out kind of low quality units that are unsuitable. I've heard some people describe this as kind of the risk of unit farms, which I think captures it quite well. But as well as not maximising the co-benefits for climate and communities, etc., that can be created, this is also a really big risk. What's the point of putting in place new habitat if it's going to be destroyed by flooding or other climate impacts or environmental contamination in 10 years' time? So next slide, please. So this is a very simplified map we put together on BNG's interactions with other nature policies. You can see there's a lot of red dotted lines. That means the relationship is unclear at the moment. And this is exacerbated by and say partly the result of a period of really mixed and ambiguous messaging on nature from successive governments. Currently, we've still got key documents such as the land use framework, which have been really delayed and are outstanding. Though I was really pleased to see we had the guidance on integrating local nature recovery strategies with local planning systems published, I think it was yesterday or maybe the day before. So that's one more piece of the jigsaw that is slotting into place. BNG itself and also environmental land management schemes have experienced multiple delays and mixed political messaging. And the uncertainty that this causes is especially difficult for landowners who are having to make decisions about their land that are locked in for decades. And one of the key relationships that is in place for BNG is that priority areas identified in the local nature recovery strategies get a strategic significance multiplier in the metric, meaning they're able to create 1.15 times more units than they would otherwise create. Next slide, please. These are some of the specific recommendations we made to try and take more of a systems approach to BNG, including reviewing the effectiveness of the strategic significance multiplier at this current level and piloting a higher multiplier. Also, we recommended that we should be promoting the wider use of the environmental benefits from nature tool, which has been developed by Natural England and can be used alongside the biodiversity metric to enable stakeholders to take into account and achieve wider benefits for people and nature from BNG. Next slide. And then also what we kind of came across looking at these BNG systems and the systems that BNG operates in is that some interactions are in conflict. So following the biodiversity gain hierarchy, BNG should always be delivered on-site if possible. On-site gains are more likely to have a positive influence for residents and for the local economy, including improved air quality, landscaping, and access to green space. Yet, on-site gains are often delivered on kind of small or randomly situated pockets of land with currently limited opportunity to link up with a wider network of sites. So there's no consideration in the metric for connectivity of sites. On-site gains are also less likely to be monitored and enforced, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And so the biodiversity gain hierarchy is sometimes at odds with aspects of the Lawton principles of bigger, better, and more joined up spaces for nature. So I think there is a debate to be had about if the biodiversity gain hierarchy is currently driving the strategic large-scale nature recovery needed. And the announcement of a nature restoration fund definitely shows a current trend in government thinking towards kind of the latter, towards this more like strategic nature recovery, not mitigation of environmental impacts on site. So next slide, please. So yeah, I think this is one to watch, and we are recommending that Defra uses statutory credits to fund strategic nature recovery at scale, and also uses the money from a small sites levy if that was implemented, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And also that that Natural England should review the biodiversity gain hierarchy, and that's something that the sector I think needs to kind of explore and think about a bit more as well. So next slide, please. So the next section is on tightening exemptions. Next slide. And yeah, not all planning applications, of course, are subject to BNG. Householder applications are exempt from BNG and make up the vast majority of planning applications. And there are other specific exemptions, including for small-scale developments that are considered to have a negligible environmental impact, so the de minimis exemption, and for small-scale custom and self-build developments. Next slide, please. So yeah, you can see here that it's been a bit of a hot topic. There's been a bit of back and forth on this. There's been different figures thrown out by, originally the first one was by BDP Pitmans, also Wildlife and Countryside Link. Our report actually cites data by Knight Frank. And kind of the government has, Defra has been going back and forth with these different stories in kind of this, back and forth in how many planning applications are subject from BNG and are enough planning applications being subject to BNG. But what our report says is that as no official figures have been released And because all of these analysts are using different data sets, or if they're using the same data set, with different filters on them, it's impossible to compare these figures with the reported expected levels of applications subject to BNG, which in itself Defra has not been very clear on. So what we call for in the report is for Defra to publish the proportion of planning applications subject to BNG every year, broken down by local planning authority to enable proper scrutiny to take place. Next slide, please. However, it was clear from our research that either the real or perceived risk of developers manipulating the BNG system through exemptions and also through things like manipulating the metric, or that wouldn't really be developers, that would be ecologists, but this risk of manipulation or exploitation is placing a significant burden on LPAs to check and double check applications. So that slows down the assessment of applications and also causes tension between LPAs and developers. And this is one of the reasons that we've called for a regulator to arbitrate and penalise those who've been found to incorrectly apply exemptions or manipulate the metric. Again, more on that later. But also we've recommended for Defra to remove the custom and self-build exemptions to help reduce this tension and this double checking and the bureaucracy that comes from that. And also because those two exemptions don't have any ecological basis. Just because something's a self-build or a custom build doesn't mean that it's not going to have negative impacts for biodiversity. So next slide. So the third area we looked at and made recommendations on was good BNG data. So going into that, before planning permission can be granted for a development, the applicant must provide certain BNG related information, including the pre-development biodiversity value of the site and details of any irreplaceable habitats. Applications can't actually submit a biodiversity game plan until after planning permission is granted, though it is best practice to submit a draft biodiversity game plan at application stage. So you can't actually submit a biodiversity game plan until after planning permission, but then you do need to submit a game plan after planning permission is granted before construction can commence. And in practice, there's a large variation in BNG information asked for and given to LPAs at the planning application stage. Many LPAs have brought out their own BNG template or BNG report. There's kind of cautiousness with using the phrase BNG biodiversity game plan because of that kind of quirk in the way it works that I just mentioned. So yeah, we've got a bunch of small recommendations here that we think could make a big difference to ensure that for developers working across the country, there's a bit more consistency in the data that's being asked for, and that, yeah, across the country, data is collected in a consistent, accessible, and robust way. So next slide. So yeah, these are the recommendations I was talking about. As I said, just quite minor changes that would be required, but we think that could make a big difference in having more consistent data collection. So next slide, please. So yeah, on to support for small developers or small sites, everyone's favourite topic when it comes to BNG. So as you all know, small sites have limited space to deliver on-site gains because the site is by nature small, clues in the name, and for residential sites, you can't secure gains on private gardens. So when gains are delivered on small sites, there is often no monitoring requirement, and the likelihood of habitat creation enhancement being secured for 30 years is relatively low. So it's difficult to get on-site gains on small sites, but even when you do, in practice, are they going to be monitored and enforced? Seems unlikely. And if you do have to require developers, if it is a significant on-site gain and they are required to actually, produce a habitat monitoring and management plan, is that not overkill? So it's a difficult situation. So the challenges with securing gains on-site means that small site developers often have to purchase off-site biodiversity units, However, they typically only need a fraction of a unit. Many traditional providers don't provide this, though there is some really great online trading platforms that are offering this now. So, BNG I think is the main name that is doing really great work on this. However, this can be disproportionately expensive for small developers, and looking at the burden on ecologist time, because even though small sites, technically you can use the small sites metric, which doesn't require an ecologist, in practice most of them are being done by an ecologist or are just using the normal metric. So it's a disproportionate burden on ecologists, it's a burden on LPA's time. Both groups are already very stretched. And are the requirements proportionate to the biodiversity benefit that you're getting? We don't think so. Next slide. So that's why we're calling for a small sites levy to unlock the development of small sites. And then with those funds raised, ring fence for strategic nature recovery at scale. So for instance, through funding to LNRS in the area, maybe going into the Nature Restoration Fund, once we know a bit more about that, but something like that. And we're in good company. SIEM has also called for this, and they've got a really great report that goes into small sites issue in more detail. So if you want to look into that, I'd check it out. So next slide. So yeah, our fifth set of findings is kind of on the biodiversity market. And our research was clear that most local planning authorities are overwhelmed with the demand for Section 106s. So actually, to just backtrack, as it says in the slides here, so off-site biodiversity units must be secured through a legal agreement, which sets out who will do the BNG creation, enhancement and management work for at least 30 years. So the legal agreement can be a Section 106 agreement with the LPA or a conservation covenant agreement with a responsible body, but I'm just going to focus on LPAs and Section 106s. So yeah, as I said, our research was clear that LPAs are overwhelmed with demand for Section 106s, and that subsequent delays to processing Section 106s are really seizing up the planning system. And that to speed up the process of Section 106 is really what you need. No one wants to hear it, but we all know it is a radical investment in LPA capacity, specifically capacity in terms of ecological expertise and also legal expertise. So next slide, please. So yeah, you can see here, there is a severe shortage of LPA staff across the country. And the ecological skills gap in local authorities in particular has been well documented, including by ALGE and also the House of Lords Built Environment Committee. The government has recently committed to recruit 300 new planning officers over next year. But research by the Home Builders Federation last month estimated that actually you need more like 2,200 planning officers to start to fill the gap that LPAs have. So yeah, a radical investment in LPA capacity, more towards that 2,200 figure, would unlock the planning system, we think, and enable LPAs to secure consistent revenue through Section 106s. Because at the moment, there's also this issue that they're losing out to them because some developers, some habitat banks are going to conservation covenants to secure conservation covenants with responsible bodies instead of going to local planning authorities. So they're losing out on this great opportunity for revenue generation that BNG offers. So this would actually, genuinely help deliver the government's development and house building agenda. So next slide, please. So on to our penultimate section, BNG monitoring. So I thought I'd start with a very slick diagram of how on-site gains are supposed to be monitored. Obviously, there are some slight differences for off-site gains, but this diagram we're going to just imagine on-site gains for now. So for significant on-site gains, the developer, as the landowner, has responsibility for verifying that habitat creation and enhancement is carried out as agreed during construction, and then submitting post-construction monitoring reports to the LPA. And then the LPA, we've got represented by the figure on the right, is then responsible for reviewing the monitoring reports, and they can also attend sites to oversee compliance. So there's two sets of monitoring going on, actually. There's the initial monitoring, and then there's the monitoring of the monitoring. Next slide, please. So yeah, I think these quotes from our interviewees really show that in practice, this system can be really complex, and lines of responsibility can quickly get blurred. So, you know, the landowner, who may or may not be the developer, might employ habitat maintenance contractors to maintain and monitor the site. Some habitat banks or brokers will also be involved in monitoring and will take on varying levels of responsibility, even though ultimate legal responsibility still will lie with the landowner. And the site might get sold on multiple times during that 30-year period. So you can see how the nice system on the previous slide breaks down very quickly, or can do. Next slide, please. So yeah, and even though this is 29 years away, of course, when we were talking to practitioners about this, they couldn't really comment on how, you know, the monitoring had been going, because they were in the very early stages. So even though this is, you know, 29 years away, because BNG gains are supposed to be secured for 30 years, we were told time and again that, you know, this is just realistically not going to happen for most sites, or certainly not for low priority sites. And you might say, well, this is a failure on the local planning authority's part. You know, they can set monitoring and enforcement fees as part of the Section 106 agreement. And definitely, we do need to make sure that LPAs are setting fees high enough to fund monitoring for 30 years. But we already know that other environmental obligations from housing developers often don't happen. So on the left is the Wild Justice report that came out last year, and that found that across England, only 53% of ecological mitigations and enhancements that developers have committed to undertake as a legally binding condition of planning permission are in place on the ground. It's a really good report. I would also recommend that's another one to check out. So yeah, I don't think we can just sit back and say, well, it should happen, and therefore we're not going to do anything about it, when we know it likely a lot, you know, maybe 50% of the time, it won't happen in practice. So next slide. So what are the solutions? The use of remote sensing through satellite data, drone technology, and AI has the potential to really revolutionise habitat monitoring. Natural England's Living England project, for instance, has shown a high level of accuracy in mapping habitat types and temporal changes using satellite imagery and existing data in a machine learning framework, and this is now routinely used at the national scale. While this technology may not be able to consistently assess habitats on the granular scale needed for BNG monitoring, it could act as an early warning system, with any potential issues then being assessed by ecologists working on the ground. And yeah, so you can see that picture, that's from the Living England project that I mentioned. Also, you know, better and more accessible monitoring data would help. The biodiversity game plan includes an option for on-site monitoring data to be shared with LERCs. As it's not mandatory, most developers choose not to share this data, but LPAs could also make this mandatory through planning application or supplementary planning guidance requirements, which would enable local environmental record centres, to create a monitoring map of the habitat enhancements in a local area. And then this could support monitoring efforts, including by citizen scientists, and it could also enable other developers to make more informed decisions about complementary enhancements and provide useful data in determining what works and what doesn't work when delivering BNG. Next slide, please. So yeah, you can see from that we've recommended a couple of pilot schemes that Defra could commission Natural England to do, looking at the potential with remote sensing, and also potential of an early BNG monitoring system using citizen science. Next slide, please. So the final section was on a BNG regulator. So what happens in theory if biodiversity gains are not achieved and maintained? Well, if they're subject to a Section 106 agreement, the LPA is responsible for taking enforcement action. And enforcement for non-compliance, however, is not a statutory requirement and is up to LPA discretion. But it could potentially result in civil legal action against the responsible landowner or manager. In practice, the threat of this enforcement action is, from what our interviewees told us and surveys, respondents and everything, is almost non-existent. Not all LPAs even have enforcement teams, and those that do are often operating with highly stretched capacity. And in general, LPAs, we are told, have extremely limited appetite for legal action. This means that the risks of non-compliance for landowners and developers are mainly reputational, with very little threat of legal or financial consequences. So we've already talked about a few other reasons why we need a BNG regulator: being able to arbitrate and report bad actors who are exploiting exemptions or gaming the metric, to regulate and set standards in the biodiversity market, maybe some more good cop functions as well as bad cop. But yeah, I think the strongest argument for the creation of a BNG regulator is the need for this bad cop, for a body that can take strong and clear enforcement action, for instance, through issuing fines. Next slide, please. So yeah, you can see that recommendation written down there. Next slide. So yeah, those are a summary of our findings. As I said, not everything. Please do read the report if you want to go into more detail. But yeah, excited to move on now to kind of next steps. So yeah, I'm very excited to announce that the IES and ALGE are today launching a phase 2 of the BNG in Practice project, which will be a BNG in Practice event series. So this series will explore some of the areas and recommendations of the report in more detail, including looking at what they would actually look like and what steps do we need to take to get there in practice, and what can we as a sector and as practitioners do to make them happen. And that will be through a series of webinars, workshops and panel discussions across the rest of 2025. So these are the initial events we have scheduled. Further events may be added later in the year. I'm going to say maximum 10 because otherwise I'm just going to be knackered. Some of them will be in collaboration with other IES communities. So you can see next to 4, which is a workshop on a systems approach to BNG. That's our climate action community logo. So that will be in collaboration with them. And then, of course, the marine net gain one at the end. That's our marine and coastal community logo. So that will be very much in collaboration with them, looking ahead to kind of what's going on with marine net gain. But yeah, there will be a link posted in the chat shortly with some more information. The first event, which is coming up pretty soon in a month, on the 26th of March, is available to register for now. But if you want to be kind of informed about these and when they are ready to register, that kind of things, they'll all be free. EPIC, EIA and ALGE members will automatically receive invites. So you can either join one of those groups if you're able to, if you meet the kind of requirements to join, or you can email letting me know that you'd like to receive invitations, and I can make sure to include you in them. But as I said, there'll be a link going out in the chat with more information. So yeah, thank you. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. As I said here, consider joining the IES or ALGE. Local authority environmental professionals, even those who aren't IES members, can also join EPIC for free. Get in touch, that's my email. It's also widely available on the IES website and on the link to basically all of the links that Effie sent in the chat. And yeah, just finally to say thank you so much to the Biodiversity Net Gain Working Group to all of the survey, workshop and interview participants who made the project made the project possible. And thanks for everyone for listening, and looking forward to taking questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellie. That was a brilliant overview of the report and its findings and recommendations. So thank you so much for presenting on that. As Ellie said, we're going to move into the Q&A function now. So if you have any questions for Ellie, I can already see someone coming through. Please do put them in the Q&A box, and I'll get to them in due course. Just to kick off, Ellie, obviously you ran through a number of kind of key recommendations to support BNG in achieving its potential. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you think we can encourage the government to act on these recommendations from the report.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Because you never want to be um, shouting into the void, and there's no point in doing really great research if no one listens to it, or it doesn't get to people, and certainly if it doesn't get to policymakers. So the IES and ALGE are doing advocacy work with this report, kind of behind the scenes, talking to Natural England and Defra on this. We're also really, really keen to kind of work with other organisations in the sector who are doing similar work, because there are lots of great people who I know are concerned about kind of what is happening to BNG and what is kind of really happening to nature at the moment politically. But honestly, the way that you can really help us, speaking to our audience on this, is to join EPIC, is to join the IEA community if you're an environmental impact assessment professional, to join ALGE if you're a local government ecologist, because that's the way, if we have a bigger voice, that will really help.
That's great. Thanks, Ellie. And we have a couple of questions coming in. You mentioned, of course, about the need for a systems approach to BNG, and you particularly mentioned local nature recovery strategies. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more around how you think LNRSs might help bring more of a systems approach to BNG, and kind of talk a little bit more about the local plan policy and how it kind of fits in between BNG and LNRS.
Yeah, so we think LNRSs could play a really key role in the systems approach to BNG. As I said, it's that link at the moment that we've got is the strategic significance multiplier. So if sites are kind of deemed to be significant in a local nature recovery strategy, then they'll get that multiplier in the BNG metric. So as I said, one of our recommendations is to kind of trial that looking at maybe having it at 5 or at 10, and see if that could therefore actually make the LNRS have real impact. Also at the moment, with the kind of link to local plans, local nature recovery strategies, they have to have kind of local plans have to take them into account, I think is the phrasing, or to either take into account or have due regard, some kind of pretty vague phrasing. So there's been some advocacy going on in the sector as well for can we ensure that there's a stronger link towards local plans, that they have to take into account local nature recovery strategies. As I said, there has just been guidance published on local on planning and how that links with local nature recovery strategies. I think that was just yesterday, as I said, so I haven't had time to look into that properly yet, but hopefully that will also help with some of this.
Great, thank you. And I wonder if this came up in any of the discussions or surveys as part of the kind of evidence gathering phase. But do you think there is a role for an accreditation scheme alongside a possible BNG regulator to give LPAs, developers, and other stakeholders confidence that BNG professionals are working to high standards?
Yeah, it did come up in some of the interviews that we did and some of the survey and workshop responses. It's definitely something, that as a professional body, the IES kind of did kind of jump out to us. And I think it is something that probably would go hand in hand with this BNG regulator, in terms of if there was an accreditation, ensuring just like that level of trust in the system, which is really needed. Obviously, you have got SAIM do really brilliant training programs already on BNG, so there is a question of, do we actually need a specific accreditation? There also is the question of when it comes to small sites, if we don't introduce a levy in the system, very much stays as it is. At the moment, there's that like other level of a competent person being able to undertake the small sites metric. So there might be another argument for having some kind of specific training course for the competent person that so then local planning authorities can be confident that they do meet the competency threshold. Because at the moment, I think because of the ambiguity with that, a lot of LPAs are just requiring an ecologist to do it. So yeah, it's definitely something that as professional bodies and as a wider sector of professional bodies, we can be looking at.
That's great, thank you. And obviously you went into quite a lot of detail about some of the challenges around monitoring BNG gains, both on-site and off-site. And it's an area that I think is of real importance in this space. During the kind of evidence phase gathering as well, did you kind of have many discussions around the resilience of on-site and off-site gains, particularly in the context of a changing environment, thinking of climate change, kind of pollution events, anything like that?
Yeah, well, this is the kind of key concern that ties into quite a few of the different areas. Firstly, into the why we think we need to have a systems approach to BNG. As I said at the very start of the presentation, there's no point doing a brilliant piece of biodiversity gain or a brilliant piece of habitat creation and enhancement if that's just going to be, devastated by floods because it's built in a really high risk, it's developed in a really high risk area for flooding, or if it's going to be contaminated, because we're not taking that into account. So yeah, we need to think about how can we make sure that those considerations are being taken into account when BNG is put in place. I think the land use framework should help with that. That's another missing piece of the jigsaw that we know is coming, but we don't have yet. So it'd be interesting to kind of see if that helps with it. Hopefully it will. But yeah, that's something we're going to explore a bit more as well in the systems workshop that we've got, which is one of the events which is coming up in June. So we'll kind of look at that a bit more.
That's great, thank you. And of course, you mentioned there the importance of kind of using a systems approach. Do you have any kind of reflections on what are some of the key barriers to implementing the systems approach to BNG and other kind of ecological related legislation?
Yeah, I think that's $1 million question, isn't it? I think, it's easy enough to say take a systems approach to BNG. It is really, really hard to do in practice. And I think a lot of that comes down to just like the practical day-to-day realities of working on these big complex topics, where obviously not one person can be in charge of all of these at the same time and therefore have everything in their eye line. So when you are, you've got like however many hundreds of policymakers working on these different areas, it's about how can we make sure that we bring them together, and that they're talking to each other, that they're working in interdisciplinary teams, that they're having protected time to think about the long-term impacts and how the different interconnections work. And that's something that's going to be one of the key topics that our next dialogue between discipline conference focuses on. So that's the IES's kind of annual conference where we get together members from all across communities. And yeah, our next one this year is going to be really focused on interdisciplinary working and how can we do systems thinking in practice, how can we get together interdisciplinary teams to look at systems thinking, actually what are the practical steps and requirements. So I'm not going to say I have the answers to everything on that yet, but yeah, keep an eye out for dialogue between disciplines, because I don't think the date for that has been released yet, but should be released very, very soon.
Thanks, Ellie. And yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I think there is a need for more kind of practical tips across the sector and how we can facilitate knowledge exchange and actually develop kind of truly systems approaches to some of the challenges we face. I've got a couple of questions here around the small sites levy, which you mentioned. So one attendee is mentioning that small sites can be on high biodiversity sites with protected species, and having a levy may run the risk of small sites using that as an argument that they don't need to do ecological surveys and just pay a levy. How could you assure that local habitats are protected if you did put some kind of small sites levy in place?
Yeah, and It's a good point, and obviously with any type of policy, there are always going to be these exceptions, and look at how you can mitigate this. First of all, what we would say is we wouldn't be forcing anybody to go for a levy if they didn't want to. Obviously, that doesn't address the real issue of how if that's going to be exploited. But we think that overall the benefits of simplifying that still make sense, even though in certain occasions you will have, as the person who asked the question outlined, you might have really high value biodiversity habitats. I think in that occasion, we would just want to make sure that outside of BNG, the planning system is still taking into consideration where we have these kind of important habitats, where we have protected species, and making sure that those systems are strong enough to protect it, and that doesn't come down necessarily to BNG.
Great, thank you. And also related to the kind of small sites levy discussion, how do you think a levy system can secure the financial support for targeted nature recovery and kind of make sure that there's a good variety of habitats that are being supported through BNG?
Yeah, so I guess this comes down to how would the funds from the levy be used? And we've said um, we haven't been super prescriptive in this. What we want to see is for them to be used for strategic nature recovery at scale. So, I think being targeted is part of being strategic. So looking kind of either you could do this looking across the local area if you wanted to ring fence those funds to come back to the actual say like local authority area where development took place. I think there is an argument for doing that. Obviously there's a bit of a trade-off then, you're not being strategic across the whole country. But either way, you then need to look at either are you taking local authority area within there, are you taking literally the whole of England within there, and being like, where are the places where if we've got the most important habitats that are most under threat with the species in them that need protection, and targeting that funding to the areas that need them most.
Great, thank you. And just building on this, another question coming through around the levy is, do you have any views on how it could interact with the government's proposed nature restoration fund, which you did mention in your presentation?
Yeah, as I said in the presentation, I mean, we were kind of like midway through writing the report when the announcement came out about the Nature Restoration Fund, which I think made us all kind of like do a double take. Definitely very interesting. But it is something, depends on the seeing more details of it before we wanted to kind of commit and say, yes, we should be using that funding to just go straight into the Nature Restoration Fund. But it definitely could go into there. Obviously, then from what the government has said, it seems like, you would lose that kind of the funding going to the local area where the development is happening. So yeah, again, it depends on which kind of scale you want to do it on. And it's always this trade-off between mitigating development where it is happening, whether that's on the site itself, trying to mitigate it in the area that's happening, but not on the site itself. Which certainly I think local authorities would prefer, because then they get to kind of keep these benefits for their communities, understandably. Or do you want to look at the kind of national scale, where for nature, certainly this will probably be the best decision, but might not be the best decision in terms of for communities, for local economies, or for air quality, for any of those kind of co-benefits. So you can see when you start to talk about these things, you have got all of these different competing priorities, as with any policy. And again, it's that kind of like, how can we take a systems approach to making sure that all of these factors are considered?
That's great. Thanks, Ellie. And I wonder if, just to round off the questions for today, thank you to everyone that's put them in. And sorry if I didn't have time to come to yours. But I wonder if you could expand a little bit more about the role of the IES and its communities in kind of driving forward some of these recommendations, and how you see professional bodies supporting implementation of biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, well, Epic itself, I mean, I lead on Epic, so I'm best placed to talk about that. But obviously you can probably you can add some stuff yourself to this, Ethne. But Epic itself was set up to look at how can we implement environmental policies better. We've got actually some really ambitious policies on nature recovery, on air quality, on other areas in place now. Still not enough ambition. There are still more policies that are needed, but we do have some in place. And looking at, okay, how can we make sure that these policies, and BNG is one of them, really ambitious policy, world leading piece of legislation, how can we make sure that it delivers in practice? So doing things like this BNG in practice project, that is EPIC's way of being like, we are going to put our time towards this. And I think this event series is now, we've done the kind of understanding what are the challenges, and also, of course, advocating to policymakers on what changes we think. But some of the recommendations are very much kind of within the power of professional bodies, and therefore kind of like within communities like EPIC to act on. So that's what we're trying to do with the event series. So for instance, one of the events is on monitoring, which we've already mentioned in the Q&A, but the idea for that session is to actually then hear from organisations who have the capabilities to do digital monitoring, to hear from maybe like other areas where citizen science has been used in environmental monitoring, and kind of providing those suite of options, looking at what is actually available for local authorities to use, and things like that. But yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to kind of the IES and the IES community as a whole, because yeah, for those of you who don't know, as Ethne said, she's communities lead and really has like, I mean, whereas I focus on EPIC, Ethne focuses on like basically all the rest of the communities, and does so much. So yeah.
Thanks, Ellie. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of what you said. I mean, at the IES, our communities are very much member-led. We recognise that our members are the experts, but the IES has a key role, and other professional bodies have a key role in supporting competence and expertise in the sector. And that's around using our convening power to bring key stakeholders together, for facilitating interdisciplinary knowledge exchange, as I've already touched on, aligned with the IES strategy, and really helping to support that systems approach. It can be quite difficult in your day-to-day job to be able to tap into different specialisms and expertise within the sector. So the IES can play, and other professional bodies can play a key role in really bringing all of that knowledge together, developing technical support, technical guidance, and just facilitating knowledge exchange and best practice where it's available. And finally, you touched on this in your presentation already, it's about providing a unified voice for professionals as well, and advocating change for change aligned with their views and expertise. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ellie. That was an excellent presentation.
I would also, just to jump in, Ethne, sorry,
Yeah.
just to add one last thing, is that, yeah, I guess if anyone in the audience today does have any specific areas within BNG or within other environmental science specialisms that they would like the IES to be kind of like looking into, to providing support on, whether that's guidance, whether that's events, anything like that, yeah, do just get in touch with myself or Ethne, and yeah, we're always happy to hear thoughts and recommendations on that.
Exactly. Yep. Couldn't agree with that more. Thank you to everyone for attending and for taking part. And a massive thank you to you, Ellie. Have a great rest of your day.